this perhaps is one of the most exciting parts of the course. I love the art history section of art appreciation, and we've done the Egyptians and tried to do it very thoroughly with 2 introductory tapes. But now we come to the Greeks, and we call this the art and architecture of the ancient Greeks, a civilization to which we owe so much. First is democracy. The democracy emerged out of Greece, where people had an opinion, people had a vote. And of course, we today practice, as some people might argue against, but we practice democracy. The Greeks were great builders. They were great contributors to architecture. And of course, their pride and joy is what you see up on the left-hand corner, the Acropolis, which we're going to talk about in detail. But they painted a lot about their lives on vases, black backgrounds, and they would paint figures and activity and Greek life on the vases. They put a lot of emphasis on sculpture, particularly sculpture that moved during the classical period. And down on the right is a very famous piece called the discus thrower. And as you know, the Greeks were responsible for giving us the Olympics, came out of Greece. Plato believed that the body was the temple of the soul. So therefore, if it were kept, and if it were kept with exercise, and it was kept with good physique, then the mind would be clear and sharp, and longevity in life would be a reality. So it is my pleasure to go into the art of Greece. Oh, Greece is such a wonderful place. I've been fortunate enough to visit it some 7 times, and each time I go, I see something new. I go to islands, and Greece has a mainland and 2,200 islands. It has temples on many of the islands, and it all boils down to one thing. If you were to ask the Greek population, it's the glory of Greece. They love to talk about particularly the period 500 BC. The Acropolis it was the center of religious and social activity during the time of Pericles. And that picture I took, I'm about a block away from the hotel. I enjoy staying there and walking up that hill at night. And we see a sundown, and later on, we will see how the Acropolis is lit up. As I mentioned just a moment ago, the Greeks told their stories on vases, so you could see a lot of activity, particularly with dealing with olive oil and rivalries and inventions and all kinds of things, and you could find their stories written, so to speak, in a pictorial sense on the vases. So the Acropolis, yes, it looks like ruins, and it looks like it's deteriorating, and it is. But as I will show you later on, the Greeks have chosen to try to rehabilitate and maintain it, but it has deteriorated in the last 70 years more than it last 2,000 years because of acid rain. And the acid rain has a very negative effect, a crumbling effect on marble. But this is the way the Acropolis looked some 500 BC. You had major buildings. You had the entranceway, which is here, and we call that the Proport. And then we had a statue of Athena, but inside this major building here is called the Parthenon, the most imitated piece of architecture in all the world. We see it anywhere there's a democracy. In our own country, we have banks, we have schools, we have institutions, we have colleges and universities, and we have courtrooms and courthouses right across the street from Essex County College. You can find the remnants of a Greek temple. And this was considered the most perfect building of its time and has been, as I said, imitated in France and England and all over the world. We see a building over here we will call the Erechtheum, has a porch with maidens, and we'll talk about that. And on the right here we have a little temple we call Temple of Athena Nike. So the Acropolis is located on the highest hill in Athens. The Greeks believed that gods lived in the highest mountains, and they placed their temples on what we call this Acropolis A. Now, when we studied Greek, Egyptian art, we talked about the necropolis, which was a city of the dead. The pharaohs were buried so that they were hidden. And Tutankhamun's tomb was somewhat like that, discovered after many, many years. But on the Acropolis A, above, we have this city, and we have the main building, which I told you is the Parthenon, dedicated to the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war. Its architects are known as Ictinus and Callicrates. Everyone say that. Ictinus and Callicrates. And of course, the sculpture, which we see, a lot of relief sculpture, was directed by very famous Phidias. And we will study a building called the Erechtheum, which is a building, but it has a porch, a very famous porch. And instead of columns, it has maidens. We call those maidens caryatids, a female figure used as a column. So here we see the Acropolis as it appeared, 500 BC. Had an amphitheater, had two amphitheaters on it, and then other buildings around the Acropolis, as I said, the Temple of Athena Nike, the Proport, the Theater of Dionysos, which is an amphitheater. It's like the half of a breakfast bowl cut in half. The bottom was the stage, and of course, the half seated the people. We'll see that momentarily. Now, we call a Greek marketplace the Agora. Everyone say that. The Agora. And much took place in the marketplace. They held trials. They sold things. They had public announcements. So the Agora in Athens was a central place for people to express themselves. And this Parthenon, Athena they had a statue of Athena that was 60 feet high. Her headdress was just inches from the roof. And these are figures about the size of people. And this giant statue of Athena, when you walk through the door, you were just stunned. So as I said, the Acropolis is located in the highest hill in Athens, and the buildings we will study will be one, the Parthenon, and its architects Ictinus and Callicrates, its sculpture supervised and directed by Phidias, the Erechtheum, which is the porch of maidens, and to understand what is meant by a caryatid, a female figure used as a column. I'm standing on the top of the Acropolis taking this photograph of the waterways, many ships, but this is the city of Athens. And this is on one of the islands where we will see Greece has a mainland and 2,200 islands. And of course, this is my breakfast plate being a little bit more. But what an ideal place to have a cup of coffee or your lunch, looking over some of these islands, these 2,200 islands. The buildings are painted in white because white reflects heat, and it gives a uniformity to the village and the island. And of course, everyone just about owns a boat, and everyone eats fish. It's a fascinating adventure to travel in the islands of Greece and to see these warm colors painted on top of the white buildings. And we're looking at a couple of the islands, not very large, but a couple of the islands of Greece. The Greeks told their story, as I indicated, on their vases. And here we see life depicted of some slaves who are shaking an olive tree. An olive tree is almost impossible to kill. There's one in the Garden of Gethsemane in Israel that is 2,200 years old. That means that olive tree was there when Christ prayed in the garden. So the Greeks, during this time, the olive was a key factor to their livelihood. Olive oil was used for the skin. It was used as a medicine. It was used as a basis for light. It was used, people would, even today, believe in taking a spoonful of olive oil. And of course, it was used for cooking. So the olive depicted here on this vase being shaken from the tree, then being crushed into olive oil, made a unusual and fantastic commodity. And the Greeks believed in slavery, and we'll talk about that a little later on. So even their mythology was painted on these vases. And Greece has a mainland, as I said, where the word Greece is, and 2,200 islands all around it. And you see a couple of the islands. You see two right in front of you, and we're on one with these temples. There's nothing like staying on a Greek island. And this is the amphitheater I was telling you about. That half a bowl, that bowl which is cut in half, and then this building with the red roof was used for the actors and actresses in performance. They would get dressed up and come out on this stage, which was the bottom of what we would call the bowl, and this was the amphitheater. Everyone could see, everyone would walk up and down these aisles. And so when you look at the Acropolis from an aerial point of view, you see it's very high above the city, and you see the ruins and the theater, which we will look at in detail. I have been there many times, as I've told you, and this is one time I'm on my way. We're walking up to the Acropolis, up, and I'm pointing to the Parthenon. And we're climbing up that hill, as everyone has to do. Now, there are a couple of fundamentals that I want you to really grasp here. One is called the Greek portico. The Greek portico is a porch, and it is supported by methods of building what we call the post and lintel. Two posts and a lintel across create a simulation of a building. If you repeat that, you will have a building. And the Parthenon was built much like that. But in architecture, this triangular shape here is called a pediment. Below it, usually we have a rectangular shape we call the frieze. And many times we put sculpture and lines and all kinds of things in the frieze. And then directly above the columns are what we call the architrave. The columns tell us, or these are the capitals, which are the tops of the columns. And in this case, it looks like a Doric order. We're going to study the three orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. And when we have lines in those columns, we call them flutes, F-L-U-T-E-S. So here I am in one of the islands. This is a Doric temple, the ruins of it. You see the lines here are the flutes, and you see that this is the Doric, this is a triglyph, this is a metope, and here's the architrave, which we will study. Now, the reliefs on the Parthenon were fantastic. Ictinus and Callicrates did the designing, but Phidias supervised the sculpture. And the Greeks created columns much differently than the Egyptians, who really focused in on a solid piece of limestone, and so their columns were extremely heavy. But as I will show you shortly, the Greeks would cut theirs up and place a dowel in between and lock sections of it so as to create these columns. So the Greeks contributed much to architecture and building. They gave us the use of the post and lintel method, the use of the pediment, which is that triangular shape sculpture combined with architecture, and then stucco, something we kind of take for granted, is plaster, and that was developed for building, for sealing cracks and decor, and that was given to us by the Greeks. Up on the Acropolis, and we see it in the background, but in the foreground is a hill. That hill was a forum setting for people who wanted to go up and talk with Greeks about new philosophies, new ideas. And Pericles, this is a picture of Pericles, who kind of built the Parthenon building and the whole Acropolis to the glory of Greece. He was the leader, and they had just completed great military and naval victories. So he wanted to create a temple that was like none other in the world. And he really spent all kinds of money. If the Parthenon were to be built today, it would cost, some people estimate, $1 billion because it was all marble. But across from there is something we call the Pnyx, or the Bible calls Mars Hill. And in the 16th, 17th chapter of Acts, you'll see St. Paul went there, saw a sign that said, dedicated to the unknown God. So he came up on this hill and talked to the Greeks about Christianity. So I've been fortunate enough to travel to Greece many times, as I've told you, and this is that hill. Now, I'm standing up on this ledge, looking back at this hill, and I'm pointing to the Pnyx, or Mars Hill. I've climbed up there many times, but I think the last time I decided not to do that anymore because I had to crawl. The marble was so slippery, I had to crawl down feet first. But what a fantastic experience. Now we're going to I'm going to give you a copy of this diagram, which I expect you to master. Not everything, but A, B, and C represent the different Greek orders. For an example, A is Doric. It has a frieze, and it's composed of a triglyph and a metapiece. So 4 and 3 would be here. And these columns have lines. They're called flutes. And then the next one, B, is Ionic. Why? Because it has the scrolls. The scroll is called, what is it here in 11, a volute. So we have the pediment, and then we have the frieze, and then we have the architrave. Then on the right here, we have the flowery column with lines that are fluted. All three have a base, but at the top we have these flowers. We call that Corinthian. And the name of that plant is called the acanthus plant. That's number 16. Now we're going to study these orders as we study Greek architecture and art. The Greeks were polytheistic, meaning that they worshiped many gods. And here we see a pictorial rendition of Zeus in the center, who was the chief of the gods we know, Greek mythology. You have Athena here on the left, and you have other Greek goddesses and gods in that picture. But some of the major characteristics of Greek art, particularly architecture, focuses in on what we call formalism. symmetrical balance. Anytime you have a geometric shape, if you cut that in half, it's always going to be symmetrical. So whatever is on one side is on the other. If I cut, we are symmetrical as human beings. And we remember when we were in school, we used to cut against, we would fold a piece of paper and cut designs against the fold. And when we opened it up, everything would be equal. The Greek sculpture focused in on their gods and goddesses as much of their subject matter. And the emphasis was on the human body. We're going to explain what is meant by the Choros, who was kind of stiff, but a young man stepping out into freedom. They painted many flowing figures on their vases, black figures with gold or light backgrounds. And they put a lot of emphasis on reason and order. They really believed in the perfection of the human body. And so while they showed human weaknesses, the Greek gods and goddesses, they were always presented as Hercules, well-fit and healthy. So this is the way the Parthenon looks today. They even have special meters and whatever. Many people try to take a piece of the Parthenon home with them, and they are very guarded against that today. So they also used drapery, suggesting wetness or wind. And they used the caryatids, as I told you before, these maidens as columns. They painted on vases, and of course, in the Parthenon, the columns kind of slant inward, moving toward the capital, a device we call a batter. And so this is how she looked, according to an artist. And of course, when you came into the temple, you were stunned. This is the Erechtheum, where you see the porch of maidens. And just to divert for a second, this is Corinth, where the Aegean Sea and the Ionian Sea and all come together here. And of course, by doing that from all over the world, this is the trade center. And this is where Aphrodite had her headquarters. We'll talk about that later. This represents the caryatids. Notice they are columns holding up the porch, and they are on the building we call the Erechtheum. So the Greeks gave us a tremendous amount. They gave us representative government. They gave us democracy. They gave us medicine. And the Greeks were the first to study the causes of medicine. Medicine has three categories, basically. One, where we treat the illness. Two, where the Greeks came in and they began to look at the study and causes of illness, what we call research in illness. And of course, today, the third branch is what we call preventive medicine, where we do things and eat things and stay away from things so as to prevent illnesses. And of course, cigarettes are a good example. So three phases of medicine, but the Greeks gave us what is known as looking at the causal, the research into the causes of illnesses. And Hippocrates was considered the father of medicine and really focused in on somewhat preventive medicine. They believed the body was a temple of the soul, so if you kept that fit, then you would be healthy. The Greeks gave us many things that we know today about plants and animals and liquids. But back to the three orders. This is the chart I want you to master. Up here we have what is called the triglyph, and that's three, 1, 2, 3 lines. Then we have what is called the metope, which is in the Doric, and then it's not in all Doric buildings, but this piece of sculpture is called the metope. Below it is the architrave, and below it is the capital, and the capital is the way we know which order it is. So we see this capital, which is a box type. We call it Doric. The lines are called flutes, F-L-U-T-E-S. we have the frieze, we have the architrave, and then we have this column, which we call the Corinthian order. And the flower is the acanthus flower. Now, let's not mistake that and call that on our exam. We don't say that's the acanthus order. That's the name of the flower, but the order is Corinthian. And we have the third, which is the Ionic, which is the scrolls. We see the frieze, we see the architrave, and we see these scrolls here, which we call volutes. So here's a good example of the amphitheater. Half a bowl, and then you have the building there where actors and actresses and performers come out, and everyone sees it from a half moon, so to speak, a semicircle. And we just covered the things about the orders. Ionic, and here we have the volute, and then we have the architrave, and then we have this pediment, and the end of this, we call it the cornice. Now, the classical idea put emphasis on reason and symmetry and proportion. So lots of geometry, formalism, the use of geometric shapes. And whenever you cut a circle or a square or a triangle in half, you always are going to have a symmetrical, two symmetrical items. Balancing one on whatever's on one side, we see on the other. They put emphasis on the humanistic physique of men and of women. And Plato said the body is the temple of the soul. So therefore we have the Olympics. The human body is always portrayed between 18 and 21 years of age, when the Greeks considered that the pinnacle or the hiatus of one's life. They used drapery to create lines and shapes, and they had sculpture that moved. But the first sculpture in the archaic period was what we call the chorus. This is during a time where it was similar to that of the Egyptians, very stiff, stepping out. Notice he's stepping out into the world, 1 foot forward, instead of at attention with both parallel feet. He, as the Egyptians did, here we see a figure that's stepping out between age 18 and 21, and he was a symbol of Greek freedom. He's called the Kouros. And the Kouros changed a bit. We had 3 stages of Greek sculpture because we had 3 stages of Greek art and architecture. The first was archaic. Then we went to the classical, which had more movement. And then we went to the Hellenistic, which was around the time after Alexander the Great. So this is the way the Acropolis looks today. Fascinating. It is remarkable. On top of the Acropolis, and for us to walk up there and see what must have been 500 years or 2,500 years ago. The goddess Athena, we don't know exactly what she looked like, but this is another artist's rendition of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, and the Parthenon as it looks today. As I told you before, the Greeks created columns in a different way than the Egyptians. The Greeks would do it in sections. So they would take a section that looked like a drum here, and on the top it would have a protruding top, and that was on the bottom. It had an open hole there, and what they would do is place the column on top of the one so as to lock the column pieces together. You see it done over here on the right. And so when the Greeks went to build a column, they did it in sections rather than one piece. Here's a closer picture of it, and you see it had this top piece that would fit inside a hole which was under the bottom here, and it would lock it in almost like a dowel or a dowel stick. This is the way the Greeks created their columns, differently than the Egyptians. So the Parthenon, the interior, this is what they think she looked like, and here's a normal version of Athena by another sculptor. So the Acropolis was located on the highest hill in Athens, and the buildings I've just indicated are one, the Parthenon, the temple dedicated to the goddess Athena, and the sculptor is Phidias. The Erechtheum, which is characterized by the maidens, the caryatids. Then we have the Temple of Athena Nike, which we'll talk about, and the Proport, which is the gateway into the Acropolis. So you see me here pointing. 20 years ago, they had a big debate in Athens, a referendum. Shall we use modern acrylic to restore the Parthenon to what it looked like 500 BC, or should we let it remain as it is in its deteriorating state under acid rain? Acid rain has destroyed more of the Parthenon over the last 70 years than it has the last 2,000, because the effect of acid rain on marble is a crumbling effect. So today, if you go up there, you will see scaffolds where they're trying to reinforce the Parthenon. And in its day, you had the Proport, you had the temple or the Amphitheather of Dionysos, you had an interior theater, you had the Parthenon, the Erechtheum, and the temple of Athena Nike, all on the top of this hill. This was the Proport. And the last time I was here, it was raining, and it was very slippery. I had to watch every step because this is marble, and the Greeks have chosen to leave it the way it is, marble. The Erechtheum from a distance, this porch of maidens called caryatids. Let's remember that. So Mars Hill was that hill I showed you and pointed to. There was a sign here said dedicated to the unknown God, and Apostle Paul came here and saw that, and saw it as a means of addressing the Greeks up on top of this hill. So he went up on top of this hill, which the Bible calls Mars Hill, the Pnyx, and you can see why I crawled down rather than came down, because it's easy to slip. And here you see Pericles in 500 BC. In its day, the Greeks wanted to hear new philosophies, new ideas, new thinking. And this shows Pericles giving knowledge to the Parthenon or the Acropolis that he was trying to build to the glory of Greece. And I'm pointing to that from the top of the Acropolis. Here, I didn't get a chance to walk through the Parthenon because they're restoring it, but they do have a fencing, and I was able to stand outside and point certain things out to you. So this is the way the Acropolis looked back in its day. The Proport, the Parthenon, the Amphitheather of Dionysos, and the Amphitheather on the other side. And the Erechtheum you can see here, and the temple of Athena Nike right on the edge. Notice this temple of Athena Nike is small. It just sits on the ledge, so to speak, but it is ionic and it is fluted. So when I ask you, what is the order of the temple of Athena Nike, you will respond that it is ionic. So as we said before, the marketplace is called the Agora. Let's repeat it again, the Agora. And the Amphitheather of Dionysos, located on the hill of Acropolis, they have all kinds of concerts there. And the high point of Greek development was what we call the classical period, dominated by one leader named Pericles. The emphasis was on order and symmetry and geometry. So this is a sample of the way the amphitheater looked and looks today. It's been preserved. You see the stage. You see a half a bowl. You see the building behind it was for the performance and actors to prepare themselves when they came out, and this was the stage. Everyone could see them in the amphitheater. Here's the amphitheater of Dionysos on the Acropolis at night, and here's a concert by a famous jazz musician called forget his last name. It'll come to me in a moment, but it's the Amphitheater of Dionysos. And the name of that artist was Yanni, a very famous Greek person involved in jazz, Yanni. And he gave a concert that I was most fascinated with. At night, when you go up to the Acropolis, it's lit up. If you go to Cairo or if you go to other European cities, these centers that are lit up. And, of course, you will see ruins of amphitheaters. So Greece developed out of a lot of rocky hills, 2,200 islands. So they created what was called combinations or alliances, city-states, Ionians, the Corinthians, the Spartans, and, of course, the Athenians, the Dorians, and many of them focused in on war. Spartans, particularly on war, were good warriors, but they didn't focus on academics. And we had three periods in Greek art history. One is archaic. Two, the classical period, where things begin to move. And three, the Hellenistic period, which was the post-Alexander the Great period of development. So let's look at this as it relates to architecture now. The first was stacking and piling. That was mastered by the Egyptians. One stone on top of another, reinforced on either side. We called it stacking and piling. No cement, no binder, just cut to precision. And the pyramid is the perfect example of stacking and piling. Then we have post and lintel, which the Egyptians used, but was developed in a sophisticated way by the Greeks. And that's post and lintel, two posts and a cross member we call lintel. That's a method that was perfected to create vaults and buildings. And then the pediment, which was a simple roof, we kind of take for granted, but that was created by the Greeks. It reflected water. So the Greeks combined sculpture with architecture. They gave us what we know and take for granted as stucco that would bind pieces of stone together. And they gave us the three orders, Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian. And they gave us the amphitheater, this outdoor theater shaped like a half a bowl. And everyone was able to be seated and to see. Keep in mind, I want you to know the difference between the Doric order and the Corinthian order, which has this plant called the acanthus plant, and the Ionic order, which is composed of scrolls. The Greeks also gave us all kinds of literature and drama, and they call them tragedies, they call them comedies. Lots of drama. It was very loud, sort of like the Apollo Theater. If the Greeks didn't like what they saw, they'd yell you off of the platform. The Greeks gave us essays and poetry, and many times plays. Lysistrata by Aristophanes is one that comes to mind. The alphabet was later altered into Roman, but the Greeks gave us a good portion of the alphabet. And of course, we have great philosophers like Plato and Aristotle who came from Greece. They were good at casting in gold. Here we have a mask of Agamemnon, and we have Poseidon. This was found at the bottom, was in water when they found it, intact, perfect physique. And I don't care if you were 100 years old, your body in Greece would come out looking like a 20-year-old, well kept and fully athletic body. Remember, Plato said the body is the temple of the soul. So we see this piece of bronze that had been down, that salt water did not damage it, was underwater and was found at sea. It's very interesting to see the Greeks were polytheistic. I showed you before a picture of Zeus and Athena. And so the Greeks had many gods. Zeus in Roman, the Romans were eclectic and adopted the Greek gods, but they changed the names. So Zeus in Greece was Jupiter in Rome. Hera in Greece was Juno in Rome. Athena in Greece was Minerva in Rome. And we could go down and see that each had a different name, but they were the same gods and goddesses. So again, this emphasis on the physique of a man. Quite surprisingly, we used to call these, tires around one's chest, and this is very unusual to see a Greek portrayed that way, because usually he has a flat stomach and that body is portrayed in a very ideal way. This is Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And it's a long story, but she had her temple down in Corinth, the temple of Venus. Obviously, we know because of this was Greek mythology, but they conducted an income temple called the Temple of Venus, and the Temple of Aphrodite, rather. And they had 2,000 prostitutes who worked for Aphrodite. They would go out into the city of Corinth, which was just booming with commercial money. These men selling their goods, the ships coming in. So they would point to a person and they would have to pay. And they raised a lot of money for the temple of Aphrodite. Notice Aphrodite would not be considered ideal for Western fashion today. New York, Paris, London, all worship the thin image. We call it the Western aesthetic. But here's Aphrodite, who represents the most perfect figure of the female at 500 BC. So again, the Greeks gave us the Olympics, they gave us representative government, they gave us medicine, they gave us architecture that is all over the world. And they gave us a focus on order and proportion and a humanistic focus on man. They used drapery to create activity in the sculpture, so that when we look at the general observations of these great civilizations, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, Asian Pacific, Indian, and Persian, they're all giants in civilization building. All have contributed. All were literate, highly literate civilizations. It's focused on art and written law and writing and reading and scholarly pursuits. They kept records. And while some of the groups, like the Spartans, were great warriors, because they didn't focus in on academics, like the Athenians with the art and medicine and science and all of the academics, those civilizations tended not to last as long as was the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans. So the Koros represents that 18 to 21-year-old, the life was depicted on the vases, and perfection in physical form was emphasized. This is the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., and if you or a Greek were to come to D.C., they would be very much at home because many of the buildings look like Greek temples. Why? Because we want to emphasize the repetition or the duplication of a democracy. So many of our buildings, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, the Mint, the Capitol of the United States, all emphasize what came from Greece and Rome. Now, the Romans gave us the dome. And here we see the Greek portico. This is a building in Rome. It's the oldest and only building intact, built 100 AD, and it is fantastic. It opened this morning. It still stands. Raphael is buried there. But we see the Greek portico, and then there was an error made in between, but they created this rotunda that was given to us by the Romans, not the Greeks, but the Romans. And it had a hole in the top in which the rain would come down. And that floor is as colorful today as it was 2,000 years ago. So it looks like we have Greek temples in the capital of the United States. We have the temple here, we have the pediment, we have the columns which look Corinthian, and we have the dome, and we have a rotunda, and many presidents lie in the rotunda in state upon death. The Greeks also gave us so much literature. We have the Trojan horse. We know the story of the Trojans and how they gave this horse as a gift, and they hid inside and then came and conquered the city. The Greeks wrote about their mythology, their heroes, Hercules, and these monsters, Greek myths, and all kinds of imagery, all kinds of monsters. And again, the life was depicted on these vases where the olive was a very important thing. The kouros, this is that young man stepping out on his own. We call him the kouros, between 18 and 21. And he is pictured in the archaic period. Now, during Alexander's time, he conquered most of the world, starting with Macedonia over here and coming all the way across. He conquered Egypt. And of course, Ptolemy took his throne, but he was considered a pharaoh. And then he did Persia and much of Asia and conquered much of what was known as the world at that time. So the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans, those three civilizations, mastery of limestone, hydraulics, painting, carving, mortuary science, coming from the Egyptians, post and lintel coming from the Egyptians. And then we have the Greeks, the pediment, the frieze, which incorporates sculpture, the three classical orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. And then we had sculpture that tended to move like the discus thrower. The Ionic, again, the scrolls, we call those scrolls the volutes. We have the Doric, looks like a box-like figure, and the Corinthian, where we have the acanthus flower. That's the name of the Corinthian, of the flower on the Corinthian column. So the Romans, we're going to come up in a moment in our next discussion about the art of Rome. The Romans gave us the arch, and that allowed these heavy walls to have openings with what is called a keystone. The dome, the Romans gave us that because they developed that dome. We have many domes throughout the world, the rotunda, and then the Romans were great road builders. They would build roads, and there's a roadway called the Appian Way, and people rode on that same road the Romans built around 100 AD. The Romans gave us cement and concrete, and that is something we take for granted. And the Romans gave us aqueduct water systems. They actually had running water in Rome, in the homes and in the city, 100 AD. And when the Romans created the arch, see what it did was open up, and that keystone allowed the weight to be shifted. Always do this in class. Always stand up with someone and hold up my hand against theirs and have them lean on their left foot and I lean on my right foot. And where we met, where our hands met, that's where the force would be. And that's how they created the arch. If you repeat the arch, then you have a tunnel, and we call it, we have two types of vaults. One we call a barrel vault, and the other we call a tunnel vault. And then we have this Pantheon. The one I told you looked like the Jefferson Memorial. It is intact, the only temple intact that was built 100 AD. It has a Greek portico, and then it has the rotunda in which you have a perfect circle inside. So what a pleasure it is to present some of the art, some of the architecture, some of the painting, some of the sculpture of the great Greek civilization. And I want you to look at this digital video at least twice. I want you to review the handout I've given you because many of the things I will ask you later on will come from these presentations. So enjoy the art of the ancient Greeks, the architecture of the Greeks, but know that they have contributed so much to this period. We can still see Greece throughout Washington, D.C., and many of the cities around the world.